Hello friends, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another video lecture series for hypersensitivity. As you know that we have already discussed hypersensitivity. Its first two types, that is type 1 and type 2 hypersensitivity reactions. So we will just give a brief introduction or a revision of the first two hypersensitive reactions we have discussed. Basically, hypersensitive reaction, we have already said that these are kind of a reaction which are being produced against non-harmful antigens, and this response is an exaggerated response. And in type 1 hypersensitive reaction, we have already said that there is involvement of IgE antibodies and there is release of histamine chemicals by the activation of mast cells. In type 2 hypersensitive reactions, we have said that it is antibody dependent cell cytotoxicity, where the antibodies, they finally activate the natural killer cells. These natural killer cells then finally releasing various kinds of chemical substances which finally hampers the functioning of the cell by the killing of these cells. So moving on to the third type of hypersensitive reaction, that is type 3 hypersensitivity. We have already written here that it is an immune complex mediated hypersensitive reaction. So why it is immune complex mediated is basically there is antigen and antibody interaction. Because of this antigen and antibody interaction, there is formation of immune complexes. These immune complexes are being formed within the blood vessels and finally leading to inflammatory response because of the injury to the cells. So here I have tried to show a small diagram. You have antibodies, and these are the round molecules are antigens, and these antibodies and antigens, they combine with each other, forming a complex which is called as antigen antibody complexes. So how does this antigen antibody complex is formed, and why this hypersensitive type 3 reaction occurs is basically that we have antibodies in our system and somehow antigens comes there and huge complex molecules are being formed which are called as antigen antibody complexes. These are very large complex molecules. Now what happens in normal case that whenever there is antigen antibody interaction occurs and large molecules are being formed in the system, our cells, which are called as antigen presenting cells, they phagocytose all these molecules by the process of phagocytosis, and this is a normal case. These large molecules, complex molecules, are being cleared from the system by various kind of cells like dendritic cells and macrophages. Now, say for example, if there is an excess of antigens in our system, when the number of antigens in the system increases at a huge amount, large scale when it increases, what happens? Small antigen antibody complexes are being formed. These small antigen antibody complexes are being unable to be recognized by the macrophages or the dendritic cells. Now what happens? These small antigen antibody complexes, which we call as immune complexes, they finally find their way into the tissue spaces of our vascular system, or in some areas we will discuss later on. So the pathogenesis, how disease occurs by this kind of type 3 hypersensitive reaction is that this pathogenesis, it occurs in 3 phases. The first phase is phase of immune complex formation, and the second phase is phase of immune complex deposition, and the third phase is phase of inflammation and tissue injury. We will discuss all these 3 phases in short. So this is the first phase of immune complex formation. I have already said that there are antibodies in our system. These antibodies, they combine with small antigens and they form complexes which are called as antigen antibody complexes or the immune complexes. This is the first stage of type 3 hypersensitive reaction. That means in first stage of hypersensitive reaction, what happens that antigen interacts with antibodies and they form immune complexes, and this is how it occurs. The second phase of immune complex and hypersensitive type 3 is immune complex deposition. Now, these immune complexes, I have already said that these immune complexes are being unable to clear from the system by our phagocytic cells. Now, when they are not being cleared from the system, they roam around and they find a space somewhere in our blood vessels or the glomerulus of the kidneys or the synovial membrane of joints. They move around and they try to find spaces where there is huge amount of pressure. And because of the space, lack of space. So these areas are blood vessels, very small blood vessels, or the glomerulus of the kidneys where there is filtration of the urine, or the synovial membrane of the joints. Why the synovial membrane of the joints is because again, because of the filtration of blood, there is formation of synovial fluid. Again, there is huge amount of pressure. That is why these immune complexes finally gets deposited in these three areas. So the third phase of hypersensitive reaction is phase of inflammation. Now what happens? That post deposition in all these three regions, blood vessels, kidneys and your joints, what happens? That there is activation of certain cells and certain soluble molecules present in our system, which finally leads to tissue damage. That tissue damage is, preceded by inflammatory responses. So this is how inflammation, this is normal epithelial lining of the cell, and here one of the cells has, stopped in a functioning in normal way because of the activation of hypersensitive reaction over it. So summing up, this is how it happens that, say for example, we have antibodies taking from IgG or IgM, and we have soluble antigens present in our system. They combine with each other, forming immune complexes. ये हमारे पास antibodies हैं, ये हमारे पास antigens हैं. They combine with each other and they form immune complexes. Now, as I already said, they are unable to be, recognized by the phagocytic cells. They find somewhere an epithelial lining, say for example in the joints, kidney glomeruli, or the alveoli of lungs. They sit here and they start a process of complement activation. Complement system, they include certain kind of proteins in it. They are soluble proteins. When they find a kind of a base, what they do, they divide into smaller and larger molecules. Because of the division, they combine with other molecules, and there is finally formation of certain enzymes. Now these enzymes have activity of a different kind. So this C5, which is being formed by the breakage of C5 molecules, the C5a, what it does, it acts as a chemotaxis. That means it tries to pull neutrophil cells over that area where there is inflammatory response generation. So more amount of neutrophil are being recruited over that area, and C3b molecules, they give a kind of a surface for the attachment of these neutrophil molecules. Now these neutrophil molecules, they will come and bind over C3b molecules, and more of neutrophil cells are being taken by these C5a molecules by chemotaxis, and finally they releases chemicals which are very much harmful to the body. Those chemicals are called as reactive oxygen species. These reactive oxygen species finally leads to destruction of the cell. So this is how type 3 hypersensitive reaction, we have important diseases which are very important for your subjective type question as well as for your objective type questions. These are always being asked. Which of the following disease is mediated by type 3 hypersensitive reactions? Some of these diseases are systemic lupus, erythematosus, and rheumatoid arthritis. I'll discuss one of these diseases a bit in detail. So this systemic erythematosus lupus, this disease is also called as lupus. In short, we just term it as lupus. Now, what happens that you have your own antigens. These are self antigens, body's own antigens. Normally, there is no immune response generation against these antigens because they are self in nature. Now what happens that, say for example, you have your cell. This cell, it has its DNA and nucleoproteins in it within the nuclear membrane. They are being bound by the plasma membrane as well as the nuclear membrane. Now what happens, somehow either by physical injury or by radiations, somehow they escape into the system. These DNA, RNA molecules or the nucleoproteins, they escape into the system. Now after escaping into the system, antibodies are being generated against these molecules. So there is generation of antibodies against these. After generation of antibodies against these DNA molecules or the nucleoproteins or RNA molecules, what happens? There is formation of immune complexes. So we have immune complexes right now. So these are the immune complexes. Now these immune complexes now move on to certain areas of the body. As I've already said that they can move on to blood vessels or the skin area or the glomerulus. These are certain areas of the body where these immune complexes will migrate. After migration of these immune complexes to that area, what happens that they start, doing complement system activation. They will activate complement system by recruiting proteins like C1q, and finally it will recruit C1R2S2. So we have an active protein which is called as C1q-R2S2 protein. So this C1q-R2S2 protein, it will activate C3 proteins, which is being converted into C3A and C3B, and C5 protein, which will convert to C5A and C5B molecules. So after activation of C3B molecule and C5A molecule, this C3B molecule, it will activate mast cells because of the activation of these mast cells, they will release histamines, and these histamines will again recruit neutrophil cells because of vascular permeability. Similarly, C5a, it acts as chemotaxis. It recruits more of a neutrophil and because of these neutrophils, they are unable to phagocytose because these are smaller in nature. And finally, what happens that these neutrophil molecules will start secreting substances which will finally lead to harming of the cell surface, and these substances are called as reactive oxygen species. Now, how the manifestation of this disease it takes place, it can be like you have vasculitis, you have skin rashes, and you have glomerular nephritis. So vasculitis, skin rashes, and glomerular nephritis are the three main diseases which is the main causative reason for the SLE or systemic erythematosus lupus. So these vasculitis, skin rashes, and glomerular nephritis, skin rashes, you have red color over the skin like you have shown here, or vasculitis, there is inflammation of blood vessels. Because of the inflammation of these blood vessels, say for example a blood vessel is being inflamed here, there is decrease in diameter of this blood vessels which finally blocks the supply of oxygen and nutrients to these tissues. So again there is harming to these tissues as well as to the blood vessel itself, and because of the glomerular nephritis, what happens that functioning of these kidney cells finally stops. So this is all about type 3 kind of hypersensitive reaction, where we have discussed two important diseases. First one is systemic erythematosus lupus, that is inflammation of tissues, and the second one is rheumatoid arthritis, that is immune system attacking the joints. Why? Because again these immune complexes starts depositing into the joints, which finally leads to non-functioning of our joints, or there is pain in our joints. So this is how at late stage of this rheumatoid arthritis an old patient looks like. So that is all from me. Thank you very much. Next time, please do wait for type 4 kind of hypersensitive reaction. Till then, keep watching. Thank you very much.